Joining me in the studio now to discuss this, senior political correspondent at The Guardian, Aubrey Allegretti. Thanks for coming, Aubrey. Former Tory Special Advisor Charlie Rowley, good to see you. And down the line, we're joined by columnist at The Times, Hugo Rifkind. Thanks for joining us again, Hugo. Why don't we start with Hugo? There he is, down the line, recovering from COVID, in isolation at home, feeling a very special connection to the inquiry for that reason. And then we have Helen MacNamara, and we have to remember that she herself was fined, wasn't she, for attending one of the parties in the Cabinet Office. So she wasn't exactly sticking to the rules with great punctiliousness herself.
No, she wasn't. I mean, Helen MacNamara is, of course, the person who brought the karaoke machine famously to a party while she was supposed to be in charge of ethics. But I thought the evidence given today was about a lot more than just sort of bad behaviour. I mean, upsetting as bad behaviour in Downing Street was. She was talking about the actual manner in which they failed and why they failed. I thought she said something very insightful about how the extent to which female voices in the room had been marginalised. And because of that, it made the government, she felt, a little bit callous. It meant that different types of harm were not considered. They didn't think about the harm that the policy and indeed COVID itself might cause to sufferers from domestic violence, to children, to even to people in prison. She said there was a very dimensional sort of macho view of how they should bulldoze through the crisis that she felt was a lot to do with the kind of voices that were being marginalised in the room. I'm
not sure, though, that in 2023 we're meant to believe or even to say in public places that women have any particular deeper understanding of compassion or empathy or, you know, what it means to be kind to a child in distress. I think we're supposed to think, aren't we, that that is equally distributed among all sexes, genders and inclinations.
Well, I mean, it's not for me to tell you, but I think it's fair to assume that a woman in the room might have thought more about the impact on women stuck at home, for example, who had sort of, you know, difficult partners, violent partners, which I think is what she was referring to. I don't think she meant that there was inherently more compassion within women. That being said, the kind of men that she was in the room with were very much sort of, you know, macho men bulldozing through. So this is very much what she said they were doing.
Do you think, though, that there's a big difference between what she said, and I'll just requote what you said, macho men bulldozing through, and what Boris was described as and accused of being yesterday by Dominic Cummings in Lee Cain, which was a trolley, someone who didn't bulldoze through at all. You can't bulldoze through effectively with a trolley, especially not a hostess trolley, but was an oscillator, a vacillator, somebody who was so insecure and unsure that he constantly changed his mind and questioned and took advice from all different sources, which seemed to infuriate Dominic Cummings, who was, you know, expostulating obscenely in the direction of Lee Cain, saying, why the hell doesn't he just do as he's told? Why is he wasting all our time? I've had to tell him this over 100 times and he still hasn't listened. So that doesn't sound much like a bulldozer. Today's a bulldozer. Yesterday was a trolley. I don't know what's going on there, do you?
Well, I think the two can be linked. I mean, I think it's not so much Boris she was accusing of being a bulldozer. It was indeed people like Dominic Cummings, specifically Matt Hancock. She talked about how there was, I think she said there was a pattern of needing to be reassured that something, that when Matt Hancock would say something was absolutely fine, discovering that it was actually very, very far from fine. And that often you really had to check that what Matt Hancock said was happening really was happening. So I suppose maybe there were both these things combined, that you had people very much trying to sort of bulldoze precisely because Boris wouldn't make the decisions. And they were trying to sort of bulldoze him into doing the ones that they thought he ought to be doing.
An extraordinary, unedifying spectacle, isn't it, really? Charlie Rowley, I mean, your perspective on this, none of it reflects well on, I don't think, any of the participants, does it?
No, it doesn't. And the messages that we saw yesterday that came out were abhorrent and below the standard that is expected of anybody that's working in the heart of government. I think what we've seen are people retreating into their silos. So, you know, we had the Martin Reynolds, the Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, to effectively say, well, he was just an administrator in terms of papers coming into Number 10 and giving to the Prime Minister and coming back out. He wasn't part of the policy discussions of implementing COVID.
And he's the fellow known as Party Marty, isn't he?
Party Marty.
Yes.
You had Lee Cain to say that, you know, he was Director of Communications and led the communications campaign, which we all know, which was, you know, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, very effective. But wasn't part of... So lots of people were sort of retreating from being the overall decision maker.
And so what's Helen MacNamara doing? What's she saying her part in this was?
Well, I think, I mean, Helen, as the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, had a very important role in making sure that the Cabinet Office, which is at the heart of government, which is the broker between different departments, and bearing in mind every single department was impacted by COVID because of the lockdown, so making sure that the Cabinet Office is effectively running and able to implement the lockdown and make sure that every sector, in every society, in everybody, in every part of society and life was protected, or had you had the regulations in place to make sure that those industries were protected. She was absolutely responsible for the operation and leading the Cabinet Office and Number 10 in that regard.
And we don't need to labour the point about the karaoke machine and the fact that she was fined for attending one of the parties, but is it a bit rich to stand there today in this greatly kind of virtuous position, saying, you know, this was lacking and that was lacking, compassion was lacking, and adherence to the rules was appalling. I never saw it happen on a single day, when she was at the heart of the party of Partygate?
Well, she gave very, very clear evidence today, and I thought she did very well. Like, it reflected a lot of what I think a lot of people are saying about the toxicity in Number 10. But what I also think is that she I think had a lot of HR to deal with, it sounds. She was trying to mitigate things that were happening in Number 10 that people felt uncomfortable with. But I would push back slightly on what she said, because Priti Patel was the Home Secretary at the time, who, as a woman, was talking a lot about people that might be suffering from domestic abuse that would be at further risk because of lockdowns and having to stay in, perhaps with their abusive partner. So I disagree with some of what she was saying today, but broadly, you're absolutely right. When you had a Prime Minister who was very reluctant to call a lockdown because of his libertarian view. He didn't take that decision lightly. He might have revisited it time and time again. He needed maybe people like Dom Cummings and Lee Kane to sort of force the issue, to which eventually we had a lockdown, the first lockdown in March, 23rd of March 2020, arguably too late.
Aubrey, what are you seeing? Just an utterly shambolic fiasco going on there.
Yes, although I thought that Helen MacNamara's evidence was almost more insightful because it felt like she had less of an axe to grind. Dominic Cummings yesterday, I mean, there was so much sort of shock and awe behind what was being said. It was all the sort of colourful, fruity language, which really sort of hit you square between the eyes. But ultimately, this inquiry is focused on what decisions were or weren't taken and who did or didn't take them. And I felt here today, we got clearer answers on what potential mistakes were made around, for example, prioritising allowing people to go shooting in groups greater than 6 in September of 2020, when other people who maybe were celebrating their birthday, children, weren't allowed to gather in groups of that size as well. We also heard about women not being considered when it came to PPE. You were rightly pointing out that obviously a woman isn't inherently more compassionate than a man, but Helen MacNamara gave the stats to the Cabinet Office and said they make up 80–90% of nurses. So given that the PPE is required to fit them and it doesn't, that needs to be taken into account. It's those quite forensic details that I think will actually be the more important part of this inquiry.
Hugo Rifkind, some people obviously listening to this, watching this, I can't believe anyone thinks, oh, well, that was fine. What a great way to react in a pandemic. Well, that was a tremendously capable pair of hands that my life and my beloved and adored relatives' lives were in. Terrific. I can't believe anyone's thinking that. But they might be thinking, OK, it sounds absolutely chaotic, catastrophic, ridiculous. Farce got to be excellent for a comedy, terrible for a tragedy, which is what this was for so many people. But what is the point of this inquiry? What are we here for? Because it's so niche and it's so, you know, dealing in so many minutiae of who was doing what at which time, who sent what message about what, who used which, as Aubrey's just said, fruity language to about whom and all of this kind of thing. We can't learn lessons about all those tiny little things, can we?
Well, I think we have learned more lessons today than we learned yesterday. One of the most striking things she said that was less colourful than a lot of the other things she said, and certainly less colourful than most of the evidence yesterday, was that she felt the government was too steered by the science, that the government was too cowed by science it didn't understand, followed the science, allowed scientists to make decisions that should have been political decisions. Now, I'm happy to say that at the time of the at the time of COVID, I wanted the government to be steered by the science as much as possible. Mm-hmm. If it turns out that actually, you know what, scientists shouldn't have been calling the shots, there should have been more political interpretation of what they were saying that brought into account other factors as well. That is a real thing to learn and take away from this inquiry. It's of much more value, I think, than anything we learned yesterday, beyond the wisdom of not having people like this in government in the first place.
It might be of great value, but can you explain in some kind of concrete terms what you mean by it? So let's say, for example, scientists were saying, you know, stay 3 feet away or 3 meters or whatever it was at the time, because that's the best way of ensuring that if someone coughs or sneezes or breathes or sings, you're not going to catch COVID from them. So let's have some perspex partitions, as we had where I was working at the BBC, these big perspex partitions, and we weren't allowed to come within 3 feet of one another. Now, let's imagine that that's a scientific diktat stroke suggestion. And you're saying maybe they ought not to have been led by science, they ought to have been led by politics. How do you politicise or make political a bit of scientific fact or data as evidenced by your chief scientist?
Well, I mean, to use an example like that, you know, the science might say that you need to, in any sort of, I don't know, office setting, have people sitting X far apart. You need to do this kind of thing in pubs, in restaurants, if they're going to open. You need to have all these controls. The political decision is the one that goes, well, hang on, if that is going to limit deaths, and it's a very difficult decision to make, and I wouldn't like to be the one making it, but the political decision is the one that goes, well, hang on, how important is it to limit deaths that much compared to the economy? Maybe there is a trade-off there. Scientists can't make that trade-off. They can tell you what the trade-off will be, but they can't decide which one of those things to do. So if you're bringing an extra sort of political and indeed economic element into the science, it is about basically downplaying the science. It is about downplaying the immediate sense of safety from sickness, because there are other things that are considered as important. Very difficult decision to make. But if this inquiry establishes in some way that it was got wrong, that there was too much emphasis placed on individual personal safety, not least because it often didn't, frankly, work, then that is a really valuable thing for us to have learned.
Right. Let's bring Aubrey into this. So the idea that the government decision, that political decision, could have been saving lives is not our ultimate aim. What we really need to do is save the economy, or we need to balance it, or we need to whatever it is, as Hugo's just explained. But then yesterday, when it was revealed that Boris Johnson is supposed to have said, well, hey, you know, older people were going to die anyway, so, you know, whatever, it's natural wastage, 3 million of them die, so they die. There was a huge collective intake of shocked breath about that, wasn't there? The idea of politicians, you know, playing fast and loose with our lives and saying, so you die, you die. I mean, is that what taking political decisions ultimately boils down to?
It was very shocking to hear it, although I think it was suspected, really. I think that was the view that had emerged, even in September 2020, when there was that resistance. You remember, I think in October 2020, Wales conducted this sort of circuit breaker, and the UK government, or rather the government responsible for England, resisted that move, partly because there was such a fear about the economy. And we saw today more evidence from the head of the Nudge Unit, the sort of team responsible for sort of scientific advice when it comes to people's behaviour, saying again, Rishi Sunak had resisted this idea of paying poorer people to self-isolate so that they didn't go to work. That would sort of bring the economy presumably more to a halt. Maybe that's why the Treasury resisted it in the first place. These trade-offs do exist, and it will be interesting to hear more about that tomorrow. We're going to hear from Sir Simon Stevens, the former Chief Executive of NHS England, and Christopher Warmald, who's the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Health and Social Care. So I think those decisions and the sort of intersection between health and scientific advice and the trade-offs will be played out more tomorrow.
And Charlie Red is one of the examples of this that we can all remember very vividly, Eat Out to Help Out, which ultimately turned out to be hugely criticised because people did get COVID and they did get ill, and subsequently people quite quickly after were thinking, God, you know, it's not worth getting COVID and dying for a hamburger, for God's sake. What the hell were we eating out for, and what on earth was going on? But that's the kind of example of the sort of decision that Hugo Rifkin's talking about when he says political over just the price of a life is the most precious price and the most important value that we place on everything. So what do you think about, for example, Eat Out to Help Out?
Well, I think two things. I think, first of all, yes, you know, the curve had started to come down. Cases were retreating. That's why I think the decision to open the economy through things like Eat Out to Help Out, to encourage people that might have, you know, locked themselves down. In fact, well, they were locked down, who hadn't been out, who hadn't gone to their local pub or eatery, you know, to get the economy growing again. And I think this is absolutely to what Hugo was saying, because there was so much fixation on the figures and the R rate and the numbers of people that have contracted COVID and, you know, the hospitalisations. There was no regard for the unknowns, you know, the number of people that might actually suffer in terms of mental health through lockdown, the number of people that were, might be in a domestic or abusive relationship, you know, how many kids are actually going to have to catch up and, you know, through schooling. You know, none of these groups of people were really thought about, because there was such a fixation on the R rate, on the hospitalisations, on the spread of the virus. So totally understandable, but there is a whole other bucket of people that the government didn't really focus on. And I think things like Eat Out to Help Out would have been perfectly fine had also the government learnt the mistakes of the first lockdown, and there'd been a test and trace ramped up in place. Had you had the testing capability, had you had the PPE, had you had the resources into the NHS, all of these things which were DHSE's responsibility, which Helen, again, rightly said that she thought that the Health Secretary and DHSE were too happy-clappy, if I can put it like that, at the start to say, we're fully prepared, nothing to see here, we're on top of it. And obviously we discovered that that totally was not the case.
Hugo, Rifkind, I was broadcasting every day through lockdown, and because people couldn't go out, they especially did quite like phoning radio phone-in shows and talking. And obviously there were lots of very frightened people, lots of scared people, there were lots of people with COVID, lots of people who didn't even believe COVID existed because they didn't know anyone who had COVID, thought it was absolute nonsense. They were, you know, I was really inundated every day with phone calls. And we did hear from people, women in abusive relationships, saying, oh my God, I'm going to be locked in with my abuser. What am I going to do? How am I going to survive? Oh my God. And we did hear from teenagers who were, you know, having the most terrible time because their parents in whatever way were either not caring for them properly or were addicted to substances and couldn't. It was just, you know, people were suffering in the most awful and acute ways. But how could the government have exempted any of those sectors of society from a national lockdown? What could they have done? They couldn't have said everyone has to be locked down except for people in abusive relationships or except for children with irresponsible and addicted parents. How could they have done that?
Well, they weren't to know, and they were flying blind. But that's kind of the point of the inquiry. You know, we look back, it was a terrifying time. I mean, much as I'm shocked by a lot of the stuff, if not surprised by a lot of the stuff we're hearing this week, I wouldn't have liked to have been in the hot seat then. I wouldn't have liked to be making decisions. I think it was a sort of nightmare situation for anyone in government. I think we're all, in ways that we're still only really coming to terms with, traumatized by what we all went through. And so it was inevitable that they were going to make mistakes in one direction or another. It may be that the inquiry decides that they couldn't have done better. It may be that the inquiry decides they should have done the exact opposite in almost every case. We don't really know yet. That's the point of the inquiry. I think there was no right way to do COVID, but maybe we could have done it in a less wrong way.
Yeah, what do you think of that conclusion? It could have been less wrong. It was not the right challenge for that particular Prime Minister, Charlie?
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, there were mistakes that have happened. There's no doubt about that. No one can get away from that. But it is all about learning the lessons to make sure if anything like this happens again, that the government of the day, whoever it is fully prepared or as prepared as it can possibly be to make sure that we can avoid lockdowns that would have had impact on people, or to make sure that the NHS is as resourced and fully up to dealing with whatever pandemic it might face.
Aubrey, at the time, let's get personal about this, at the time, were you opposed to being locked down, or did you think, thank God, if I'm locked down, I can't catch it, I can't give it to anyone, let me stay there and I'll stay there until I can come out and won't give it to anyone or catch it from anyone? Was it much more complex than that? Were you thinking about various implications of being locked down, or just relieved?
Well, it was a strange experience because actually my birthday was the day after the first national lockdown. So I was sort of cancelled my party a few days before. And so in those first few weeks, I think to everyone, it was a complete unknown. And we sort of thought that the ultimate worst could be about to happen. And at the time I was living with my mum, who was elderly. And so there was a real sense in our household of, you know, let's batten down the hatches. And it was a gorgeous sort of first summer as well. And I remember, you know, everyone wanting to be outside together. But it was that sort of false sense of optimism from Boris Johnson where he talked about turning the tide.
He said 6 weeks,
in
remember?
6 weeks or something like that.
He had to say 6 weeks, though. Because if he hadn't said 6 weeks, it was so infinitely terrifying, it had to appear finite. As he was saying it, I think most people realised he couldn't possibly know, and it couldn't be true. However, we wanted to hear him say it. There certainly is a path and a purpose in saying things that people need to hear at times when they're utterly terrified, and there's no precedent for having been that terrified before. Anyway, we're definitely reconvened to discuss this, gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed. Hugo, thanks so much for joining us. Thank you both